Hello, folks. This week we're going to talk about outcome evaluations, where the central question of which is what is an intervention acceptability amongst the target population? Is the intervention effective at the individual and population level in achieving its stated goals? And is the intervention cost effective? Is it reasonable to do? Is it justified for the cost that is associated with operating the program? And so the reason we conduct these evaluations and want to answer these questions is because we want to avoid this so-called triple fail. Triple fails are interventions that are characterized as having low patient satisfaction, low effectiveness, and have higher costs than could be justified by the outcome of the intervention. And so to measure that, we are often concerned with mainly outcomes and impacts. And sometimes authors will put outputs as part of an outcome evaluation. I think that outputs more properly fit as part of the part of the process evaluation. But anyhow, it's important to discuss outputs, outcomes, and impacts kind of all together, because I find that sometimes it can be tricky in distinguishing between your outputs and your outcomes and your impacts. So to kind of review, outputs are the most immediate results of an activity. If you're conducting an education program, say something around contraception education, then the number of people trained or educated might be an output. Similarly, if you're operating like a food kitchen or a housing site, then the number of people fed and housed would be an output. And finally, if you're running any sort of generic intervention, say to improve mental health or to decrease tobacco consumption or alcohol consumption, any sort of thing like that, then your your output would just be the number of people who received kind of the full course of the intervention. And that would be kind of your short-term outputs of the program. Now, these are different than the outcomes of a program. Outcomes speak to the observed effect of an activity on an individual. And so this can include, for the first example of running like a food kitchen, this would be, the changes in housing stability and food security scores. Maybe you use a housing stability or food security measure, such as those in community health surveys and that sort of thing, to assess whether or not there has been a change in participants' housing stability and food security. You can also imagine for a knowledge, say our contraceptive example, is there actually a change in knowledge, skills, attitudes, or beliefs? And you might measure that pre and post kind of administration of the educational campaign. And then finally, with the final example of an intervention, that's changes in behaviors or medical outcomes. And so outcomes, again, are not about what the organization does, but what happens to individuals as a result of what the organization does. So changes in knowledge, skills, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and so forth. And this is a little bit different from impacts, because impacts speak to kind of the population level effect of the intervention. How much of your goal was achieved, and how much was that achievement attributable to your actual program? And so that's really the big focus of an impact evaluation, is looking at how much population level knowledge, skills, attitudes, or beliefs increased as a result of your intervention, how much reduction in homelessness and food insecurity happened as a result of your intervention, and then how much of the reduced morbidity and mortality associated with an outcome was attributable to your intervention. And so that's the real key here, is that impacts really attempts to get at the attributable nature. They tend to be much more long-term. So if you think of outputs as kind of the short-term results of a program, outcomes as kind of the medium-term results, and then impacts as kind of these long-term, bigger population level effects, then that's what you will look at. So for example, if your goal was to be healthier, the number of calories consumed or burned, the proper nutrition profile, the things you do to be healthy and exercise, that would be kind of the outputs. It would be the result of the activities you're doing. Then the outcome of your kind of intervention to become healthier would be, change in resting heart rate or blood pressure, changes in your body fat percentage, weight, all those sort of things could be potential measures of outcome. Some of those measures, of course, are better, more acceptable, more directly related to the kind of overall goal of becoming healthier than others. But nevertheless, those are some of the outcomes that you could imagine being measured. And then finally, the impacts would be, changes in physical stamina and energy level across your life, the mood and your affect, how happy you are with your body image and that sort of thing, the longevity, compressed morbidity, so you're sick for less time in your life, and how much of those sort of changes were attributable to your so-called intervention of changing diet, exercise, maybe some meditation, things like that. And so the short, medium, and long-term kind of view really closely aligns with this kind of principle of outputs, outcomes, and impacts. Now, for an evaluation that we kind of call an outcome or impact evaluation, those can be separated out into two separate evaluations. Oftentimes you'll see that only an outcome evaluation is done because an impact evaluation just isn't necessarily realistic. In addition to that, in addition to looking at like effectiveness and acceptability, there are also economic concerns that can be looked at. This can be through a financial analysis, which is kind of just looking at a budget and saying, how does implementing this program affect our bottom line? This can be a cost effectiveness analysis, which tries to compare kind of a status quo or alternative intervention to your intervention and say what is the cost per unit reduction in depression, or per person life saved, what is the cost of doing that and how effective is that cost relative to the status quo, or through a cost benefit analysis. And as you read in the textbook, cost benefit analyses try to assign kind of a value of the morbidity or mortality. So, we talked about a little bit in the textbook, the value of a statistical life being, I think I quote one statistic as like $50,000 per quality adjusted life years, or a statistical life being about $9 million. And so those cost kind of benefit analyses are just one criteria by which a program's impact and outcome can be evaluated. Certainly there are multi-criteria analyses that can either use weighted or unweighted criteria depending on what exactly level of rigor, level of objectiveness, I guess that's an okay word to use, that your kind of sponsor wants you to engage in when you're conducting analysis. But this allows for kind of broad inclusion and consideration of factors that are often difficult to monetize, or they're just kind of non-monetary. You could think of something like impact on life. Could be something that maybe you don't want to assign a dollar value to. Maybe your organization's uncomfortable with that, and so that's not what you would do. Certainly things like cost and time and ease of use and acceptability and health impact and safety and training requirements are all going to be part of some of the criteria. But you can imagine really any criteria that your stakeholders are keenly interested in measuring can be part of a multi-criteria analysis. So you might think of something like, well, I want to add to kind of the things we consider as we're planning this intervention about what is its effect specifically on Indigenous governance. And so Indigenous governance could be the criteria that you look at, and then you would evaluate typically each policy or option or intervention option and see which one kind of has an effect in which way. And then once you have all those criteria analyzed and you can see what the overall impact of, say, one intervention is compared to another, then the decision makers, often the sponsor, can make an evaluation as to whether or not they want to choose one intervention over the other by looking at each of the criteria that they specify. And that you as an analyst or an evaluator will be the ones to kind of provide the assessment and overview with regards to each of those criteria. And so multi-criteria analyses are really common in kind of the government sector. Certainly cost-benefit analyses, are important for convincing, Treasury Board and for convincing the Minister of Finance into to kind of adding more money into a program, or budgetary directors into sending money through the health authorities to an organization or something. So all of that is very common. You will see cost-benefit analyses, cost-effective analyses be an important way to justify a program. But certainly that's not the only criteria that we're interested in. And so it's important that these multi-criteria analyses exist, and that you're able to kind of think through, terms not only in terms of monetary costs, but overall. In terms of choosing outcomes, that will largely be determined by a number of factors, including what are the concerns and priorities of stakeholders, what components of your logic model are relevant, what initiatives are previously developed, outcome objectives, and for consistency, you might want to compare to programs, so you'll have comparisons across those. It'll also depend on your own expertise. People tend to maybe navigate a bit towards qualitative or a bit towards quantitative methods. And so who's on the team will definitely shape what you want to measure and how you measure it. But also just things like resources. As I mentioned, impact evaluations can be very difficult to do because of the long-term population effect. And most community-based organizations don't necessarily have the ability to conduct a long-term impact evaluation. To do so usually requires, backing of a big government-funded project, maybe a CIHR project, which is a 5-year, often project grants are available kind of for 5 years. But if you're looking for longer term than that, then partnering with academics and that sort of thing is a great way to kind of look at impacts. Oftentimes, impact evaluations will rely on kind of published surveillance reports, because those things are being done anyways, and so the use of secondary data as opposed to primary data collection is often how impacts will be assessed. And this is related to just simply how difficult things are to measure, because as you can imagine, the difficulty of something in measure relates to how valid your conclusions will be about your evaluation. And so this relates to some of the concepts you will have learned in epidemiology and biostatistics, mainly these concepts of internal validity and external validity, which in turn connect to kind of type 1 and type 2 error. So internal validity is the extent to which an effect that is observed was caused by the kind of planned intervention, while external validity is this extent to which an observed effect or outcome can be generalized to other time settings of population. So internal speaks to kind of the internal nature of your program. Is your conclusions aligned with how you analyze the data? Do your conclusions align with the data collected? And external validity is more about, is it generalizable to other settings and times? Does it have that kind of external convincing power to convince others to do this intervention as well? Now with the type 1, type 2 error distinction, is type 1 error occurs when kind of we draw the conclusion erroneously that an intervention had an impact on the intervention group, when in fact there was no difference between groups and controls. And so this can happen for any number of reasons. Maybe it's some characteristic of your intervention group was different than your control group, and therefore it looks like they had a significant improvement when in fact, that was just due to some third confounding factor. Type 2 error can happen when you draw the conclusion that there was no impact, when in fact it did. You can imagine this when impacts are small or effects are small, or when the effect of a placebo can be quite strong. You can imagine, for example, say something like acupuncture, which may not have necessarily much of a clinical impact, but definitely has an impact through having somebody have very tender, very interested, very holistic care provided by them, or by a healthcare provider, giving them that sort of individual time which that requires. Is that plus any placebo effects associated with acupuncture, together those things can actually produce a kind of a positive effect. And if that's your control group, something like acupuncture or something with less of an intervention, then that certainly is going to change whether or not you conclude there was an impact. And so generally we think that a type 1 error and type 2 errors are threats to the conclusions we draw about whether or not a program should go forward. And so when we think about trying to avoid those sorts of errors, there's a number of things that we want to think about. But before we get into kind of all these measures of validity and reliability and stability that you read about in the textbook, I think it's important to recognize that there are many kind of ways of knowing, and that traditional kind of scientific or evaluative approaches tend to rely more heavily on knowledge that is arrived through kind of empirical evidence. And so this goes back to discussions of epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, between kind of a priori knowledge, which is that which is known kind of independent of experience, or that it's not necessarily based on direct observed effects, or a posteriori knowledge, which is knowledge that is kind of known by experience, it's empirical. There is often a problem in science in general to discount some sources of a posteriori knowledge, like lived experience, as being a priori, when in fact those are definitely a posteriori knowledge. They're empirical, they're real, and they're valuable, and they're important to incorporate into evaluations. And so this sometimes overflows into concepts of quantitative and qualitative differences. I want to set that a bit aside till we talk later in the course about quantitative and qualitative differences, and instead start focusing on these two concepts of validity and reliability. Now, as you see here, validity, and as we'll show in a bit, the term reliability, tend to be kind of these umbrella terms. Validity relates to kind of inference validity and construct validity. And so we're going to go through these different types of validity in today's lecture, and we also cover this in the book as a good thing to be aware of, because when you're selecting these outcomes, probably the biggest considerations to preventing that sort of type 1 and type 2 error is making sure you have strong validity and strong reliability. And so the first kind of validity that we're going to cover is kind of inference validity. Now, inference validity refers to the validity of a research design as a whole, whether or not you can trust the conclusion of a study. It concerns with the nature of causality or causation and not just association, and looks at how statistical relations measures relate to the theories and the study design, and then kind of the claims you end up making as a result of what you find from your theory and study design. And so you can imagine that this is not necessarily, in some ways it's kind of an art and a science, because there's not necessarily a guarantee that when you're making inferences that it's based on reality, because you've got to take reality and compact it down into data, and data is often an oversimplification of reality. There are variables that you miss, and then once you have even data to draw inferences on kind of that intersection of what you interpret and what reality is, you have to rely on statistics, which again is a theory of measurement, and like measurement itself is a source of potential bias or source of potential error in your study. Another way to kind of model this is in this graph. You can kind of see that you might have a theory for the way that health works. This relates to kind of that causal logic or logic of your model, your theory of causation, the theory of health that you're kind of using to guide and direct your program. You can have a theory that relates to constructs, and so you can think of like, well, food stability is important to health. And so that's your constructs, is you're like, well, if we increase people's food stability, we'll increase their health. But that's got to be operationalized, right? In data, you have to measure that somehow. You can use quantitative or qualitative measures to try and assess that in the empirical domain. But again, as you kind of go from theory to constructs to actually on the ground how you're going to measure that in data, that poses some significant barriers. One of which is kind of this idea of internal kind of inference validity. So if you remember back in the graph that we looked at, there's this difference between internal inference validity and external inference validity. So internal validity requires that the conclusions you're drawing with regards to your data are actually reflected in the methodology of your data, so that what you're saying is actually allowed for by the data you have. So if you misinterpret a p-value, right, that's a threat to internal validity. If you're saying this shows causality when you don't have good control groups or you don't have a good sample, or there was threats to bias, then that's going to threaten your internal validity as well. And so internal validity sort of occurs when you can conclude that there is a causal relationship between the things you're studying. And this isn't always necessarily the result of one study. You know, causation is based on a number of things: temporal sequences, strength of association, consistency of association. All those things can help you draw an association and conclusions about causality. And it may not be just from one study that allows you to that, but from kind of a consensus and building of evidence. And so that's why we have research that kind of builds up over time. Now, there are a number of threats to validity that can kind of change how you would interpret your results. This includes things like an observer effect, right? People behave a little bit differently when they know they're being watched or when they know their behavior is being measured. There's the effect of history. You can imagine, you do an intervention, but then at the same time, there's kind of other things going on. Maybe there's a big media campaign. Maybe there's a big disease outbreak that changes people's behavior. And so you've got to pay attention to what is that context, what is going on, what is historically happening, and how is that shaping the outcome. There's this idea of maturation, which is just over the course of a study, people age, people change, people's life circumstances change, and that can give rise to differences in outcomes. And so it's important to consider that that could be a source of cause. The effect of repeat testing, right? If you're administering a scale or survey, a personality test, anything like that, when people take a test multiple times, they start to get ideas, they get exposed to new concepts. This is especially a problem with knowledge-based items, right? If you ask people at the beginning, are you aware of the impact that diet and exercise have on your heart? People might score low, but then, they know they're going to be asked that question again at the end, and so they intentionally score low, and then later they score high. Or sometimes by asking a question, you reveal knowledge. So if you say, like, are you aware of pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is a method to prevent HIV acquisition amongst people who don't have HIV, then the next time you ask them that question, just because they were asked it previously, they're going to have an answer. So that's called a testing effect. There's also inconsistencies in the way you measure. So you can imagine, if you use one scale at baseline, and then when you follow up, use a different scale. If those scales are calibrated differently, maybe that's going to be a concluded, and I don't mean like psychological scale, I mean like a weight scale is the classic example there, but this can happen in many things. So you have one person administering a survey or administering an interview, and then later on you have a different person administering that. That can be a problem. Certainly selection bias, right? The impact of sampling, we talked a little bit about that. There might be differences in your cases and controls. This is often the case when you're not able to randomize. Loss to follow-up, which is just, maybe all the people who don't benefit from your program, maybe they drop out because they don't think they're benefiting. And so when you go to analyze changes amongst those who stayed in your program, all the people who benefited stayed in your program, and so it looks like your program had a lot of benefit, when in fact, there's kind of a kind of selection bias that results from loss to follow-up. Certainly then, placebos can be an issue. We talked a little bit about that. Placebos can both inflate an estimate and deflate an estimate of an association, depending how the placebo works, depending on the nature of the intervention. Then there's also issues of contamination. This is important in settings, hospital care settings where people might be in close quarters with one another. Some people, say you're doing a psychological counseling intervention for smoking or something, and in a counseling session with your cases, you maybe give a set of tips to resist what is that called? When you just have people who resist I can't think of another word besides temptation, but that's not a good word for that. anyhow, resist the lure of smoking. And people in the control group might, kind of become contaminated. I know that's not a great necessarily word for that, but might become aware of those tips and tricks, and therefore that would minimize the effect of your intervention, right? Because compared to the controls, if the controls are also getting some form of the intervention or partial intervention, then that's going to reduce the difference between your control group and your case group. And so that can certainly be a source of bias. This is sometimes, in school settings, you can imagine, say you have a parenting, PTA type program in one school, and the control schools figure out about it, and they're like, well, we should do something. And so they implement their own intervention. It's important to recognize when that sort of things happen and account for that as a threat to the validity of your study. And then finally, there's this concept of regression to the mean. And this is basically based on empirical evidence that shows when you have extreme outlier values and you measure them, you capture those values, people will tend to regress down towards the mean. Their scores will kind of normalize if you catch them again. And so this could be for any number of reasons, and there are lots of reasons that contribute to regression to the mean. It's important to be aware of that. Oftentimes it can be difficult to actually detect or to understand, but you can look at performance of outliers in particular and recognize that they may not reflect the entire group. Outliers, are important to pay attention to in your analyses as well, to make sure that they don't serve as a threat to validity. And that's just called regression to the mean. That was a lot around internal validity and making sure that you're interpreting kind of the nature of your study correctly. But there's also this concept of external validity, which refers to kind of the extent to which your sampling and representativeness and replication speaks to the generalizability of your findings. And so a lot of this, both internal and external validity, relies on this concept of measurement theory. Now, you can imagine that the 3D world, the world we live in, is very complex and nuanced. And when we measure something, we're reducing it down to something two or one dimensional. Oftentimes, we're reporting it numerically. So we take qualities like shape, color, location, and kind of the example we see on the screen, the longitude and latitude of where an object is positioned, what angle it is at, and you reduce that down to a selected set of characteristics. And so inherent in measurement is this problem of understanding, well, is it a good enough measurement? And I think that depends to what extent you're trying to, what you're trying to measure. And so maybe number correlates well with shape, right? The twos being circles, the one being a square, triangle. But what if color is the important element, right? We didn't necessarily track color. So choosing what to measure and how to measure it is an important feature of measurement theory. Now, as we talk about measurement theory, we're really getting into that kind of other kind of concept of construct validity, which you kind of saw in the chart of the various types of validity. Now, construct validity kind of can be broken down and kind of to two additional types of validity, which we call kind of face validity, which is basically on face value. Does the measure describe the construct well? And so, if you're measuring depression, a question might be like, do you often feel sad, right? That's on face validity, that seems to be a pretty good measure. Or have you lost interest in things that once interested you? Like, the loss of interest is a hallmark of what the DSM-5 at least describes as depression. And so so that on the face value, is it a good measure? And then also with regards to its content, does it measure kind of all aspects of that? So if you look at something like the DSM-5, say for depression or anxiety, there are a whole lot of criteria that are reflected as parts of it. And so you want to make sure that what you're measuring it well, and you're capturing kind of all the aspects and dynamics of it. So that face validity and content validity, thinking through that in your measurement is one good way to ensure that your study has good validity. And so this kind of transitional validity is often evaluated by experts. However, you can involve people in the design stage of your evaluation, so you can talk to stakeholders through face value and content validity. You can show the measures that you're thinking about using, and ask them, what does this question measure, or is there a better way that you would measure this thing? For content validity, you could say, what additional questions do you think are needed to capture this concept, or is there any element missing from this concept? And so getting stakeholders involved in the measurement will ensure that your measure more closely reflects the population. This is often a problem in psychometrics where maybe a survey scale was developed amongst one population, but you're trying to use it for a different one. And so engaging stakeholders is a way to ensure that your instruments are adapted properly. Now, it's important to recognize that when you change instruments, you might change the trust that scientific community might have in that measurement. So sometimes if you're going to change an instrument, a good thing is just to add those additional questions and calculate the scale both ways and look at correlation between the two scales. We'll talk a bit about that and parallel form reliability testing and that sort of thing in a moment. But as we think through kind of construct validity, that's what you're wanting to ensure, that the thing you're measuring actually relates to the construct that you're trying to measure. If you go back to that three-level diagram of measurement, from theory to constructs to items, it's really construct validity is really focused on making sure that the items you're using to measure reflect constructs. Now, there are also predictive and concurrent validity. Now, these are two ways to think about validity in terms of comparing two related measures that are completed at the same time, or by examining the ability of a test to predict some event that occurs in the real world, being kind of predictive validity. And so concurrent validity, you can imagine, you would administer two tests, say an English test and a math test, as a way to kind of understand students' performance. You can compare their scores on the English and the math, and maybe there's a strong correlation there, maybe it's not, as predicting some aspect of performance. I don't know if that's intelligence, if it's ability to answer test questions right, exactly what that is, but that would be an example of concurrent validity, kind of issuing two measures at the same time and then drawing a conclusion about those measures. And then predictive validity is when you measure one, you use a measurement to see if it predicts some future event. And so a good example of this is like the GREs, the graduate entrance exams, and do those actually predict well student performance? I think a lot of the data kind of calls into question whether they do or not, but that's an issue for another day. But it is important to think about, does my measure actually predict something in the real world? And so that's ultimately what predictive and concurrent validity are about. Now, in addition to those sorts of validity, there's also convergent and discriminant validity. This relates a little bit back to kind of the concurrent validity, but you can imagine that convergent validity is kind of occurring when multiple constructs are related to each other in the way that you expect them to be. And so if you have a scale measuring depression and a scale measuring loneliness, you would expect those to positively correlate, that people who are lonely or emotionally lonely in particular would feel some degree of depression or sadness as well. And so that evidence would converge to say that those scales are probably measuring the right things. Discriminant validity is, say you have something like a scale measuring bipolar disorder and a scale measuring anxiety. You would expect that people who have like a diagnosis of bipolar disorder would score well on the bipolar one, and that depending on whether or not they have an anxiety diagnosis, it would change. So the point there is to make sure that the things you're measuring discriminate out from something, that I don't have a measure that is measuring both bipolar and anxiety or depression and anxiety, that ultimately it's good at sussing out who is and who is not bipolar, not capturing some other symptomology. And so this is often a problem in things like anxiety and depression, which tend to be closely related. A lot of people might have anxiety without depression, but we do see empirically that people who have depression often also have anxiety. And so that degree to which those two things overlap, and making sure that you develop scales that catch those symptoms differently, so you can say that this is a true construct and that in truth anxiety and depression aren't the same thing. And so being able to measure that out is important, and often it's surprisingly difficult to do so. And then we can think about this in terms of how well those correlate together. And so there's a number of measures of correlation that when we talk about quantitative methods in the course, and particularly quantitative analyses, we can discuss a bit more, looking at associations between various variables. And so that convergent and divergent discriminant validity, predictive and concurrent validity, and then face and content validity ultimately kind of reflect all the sources of validity that we tend to think about, or the ways that we tend to think about validity. But there's also this issue of reliability. Now, reliability is kind of measures the degree to which the instrument or the scale or the set of questions you're using to measure a construct are reliable. Can you trust the results? And generally, we tend to think of reliability in terms of two things, stability and consistency. So when we think of stability, we'll think of two forms: test, retest, and parallel form. Now, test, retest reliability is basically you administer a test at time 1 and you administer a test at time 2. You expect that between time 1 and time 2, if there's been no intervention or been no significant changes, that people's scores should be somewhat similar. So you can think of these personality tests like, INFJ and all these different kind of measures that try to classify you. You would think that those have good test, retest reliability, and that they're reliable measures if you take one now and you take it in 6 months and it gives you the same classification of your personality. That would be good test, retest reliability. But if you administer it once and you get a vastly different answer the second time, then you would say it's not reliable. And this is really important for study designs in which you measure something at baseline and then at follow-up, because it's important to know whether the change was because of your intervention or if the change was just because the instrument's not all that reliable. There are a number of things that can cause that unreliability in a measure. One can be a carryover effect. People simply remember how they answered the last time, and so they answer similarly. There can be a practice effect, which you can repeat scores can improve over repeat testing. This is kind of a classical IQ test is an example like that. If people take the test multiple times, they just tend to do better because they're answering a little bit quicker and more efficiently, and they kind of have had exposure before. And then there's just attrition, people who disappear for the retest. Oftentimes, people who disappear from the retest will have kind of traits that would pull scores in one direction or the other. And so all of those factors can kind of limit the test retest. Another measure that can be combined with test retest is kind of this parallel form reliability. So you can imagine that sometimes you have two versions of a question that you administer at the same time, and you want to know, do they measure the same thing? So this is an example if you're trying to create a new scale. A lot of psychological scales might be 50, 60 questions long, and you don't want to ask your evaluation 50 or 60 questions. And so maybe what you do is you take 4 questions that you think better capture those 50 or 60 items, and you administer both versions, and then you calculate the scores and you look at, well, how well do those correlate? And so that's called parallel form reliability, just giving 2 versions. A good example of this is something like, depression scales, which is kind of one of the scales that I'm more familiar with, is like there's the HADS, there's the CESD, there's so many different versions of depression scales or anxiety scales. And all of those, most of those will have undergone some evaluation of their parallel form reliability to assess, how reliable do scores on one predict scores on another. And so that's something that people are often concerned with, particularly if you're creating a new scale. Now, consistency is a little bit different in that it measures reliability through similarity within the test, with individual questions giving predictable answers every time. And so, so there are 2 common ways of thinking about this sort of reliability. There's the inter-rater reliability, which is, say you're doing something that requires an observer to classify participants in one way or the other, or some scenario in which you've got two people measuring something. This is often done in things like literature reviews, deciding whether or not an article should be included or excluded. Inter-rater reliability is basically counting the percent of agreement in the decisions that observer 1 and observer 2 makes, so kind of that overlap. And so you can imagine that in observation 1, that somebody, that maybe observer 1 includes that person as having, classifies them as, yes, they have a mood or anxiety disorder. Observer 2, however, says no, person 1 does not. So if they disagree enough, then you know that that's an inconsistent measure, and that you need to do something, whether that's training, whether that's getting new raters, to ensure that raters consistently rate participants the same way. And that's an important feature of reliability. And so this can be then assessed, looking at correlation if it's a continuous variable, or just percent agreement if it's a categorical one. There's also internal consistency. There are many measures for internal consistency. I don't think that you need to become an expert on all of them, excuse me, but it is good to kind of recognize the different types of internal consistency in different measures, and to understand generally stronger correlation between items indicates good internal consistency. So internal consistency would be, say you have a number of items on a scale, what is kind of the average inter-item correlation? And so, if you've ever looked at a psychological scale, if you haven't, I'm sure a lot of you have seen them, but I would go and look at these scales and see how closely do the items measure the same thing, and getting at kind of the same issue. That's what internal consistency is concerned with. So one way to measure that is average inter-item internal consistency. It's also possible to add average item total correlation, which tells you the correlation between each item and the overall score. So maybe identifying some items that maybe you can ask a question in using a fewer number of scale items, because a few of them correlate so well with the final score that you might as well just ask those smaller questions anyways. There's also split half reliability, in which you'll kind of take a bigger set and you'll randomly divide them out into two different constructs, and then see what is the correlation between that. And that's another way to get at internal consistency. Again, these are just sort of statistical approaches to kind of try talking about the same thing. The most common, I think, is probably Cronbach's alpha. This is what will often be reported in academic reports. And basically, this is calculated as a function of the number of items, kind of the covariance between item pairs, and then the variance of the total scores. And so generally, the Cronbach's alpha increases as the intercorrelation between the items increase, which means, yes, we're talking about the same one thing here, and that we're not measuring maybe two things in detail, that there's just kind of one thing that we're measuring, and that it's mathematically equivalent to the average of all possible split half estimates. And so split half, as you'll remember, was kind of one of the other ways to do it. Basically, Cronbach's alpha is just a computer basically calculates every possible split half alpha estimate, and then that's ultimately what Cronbach's alpha is similar to. There's also the Kuder-Richardson measure of internal consistency, which is good for dichotomous scores. So it's just a special case of Cronbach's alpha. Generally, as I said, with all of these, a value closer to 1 or closer to 100% tends to indicate a stronger internal consistency. And so when you see those values, when you interpret them, that's what you're wanting, is a higher one. This is also true of interclass correlation coefficients, which looks, there are lots of different types of interclass correlation coefficients. Really, to go over these is, I think, beyond the scope of the course. I don't even know of what all the 10 forms of interclass correlation coefficients would be used for, what scenarios you would think about them in. But this is often used if you want to see a scale, how a scale measures over time, or how a scale, kind of measures within like multiple versions of the scale or something. A different interclass correlation coefficient can be calculated. But again, it's like many of the other correlations, just the higher value is a good indicator. Now, kind of in concluding our kind of rapid fire discussion about validity and reliability, um, you really want your measures, whatever indicators you choose to include in your indicator assignment or in your evaluation proposal, you want them to be both valid and reliable. Because when something is both valid and reliable, you are measuring what you think you are using a measure that will produce stable and consistent results. If it's not valid, but it is reliable, then you have a measure that's reliable that you can use. It's just not measuring what you think it's measuring. And so that can be a big problem. Likewise, you can have a measure that is valid, but it's not reliable. This means that the average measurement is right on, but each individual measurement has error and is unusable by itself. And so, so that's a situation that, again, is not ideal. And then something can be neither valid nor reliable. And that's when you're measuring, if you are measuring kind of anything, it's not what you want to, and it's not going to measure the same thing every time. And so obviously that is kind of the least desirable circumstance. Generally, you can think through evidence and kind of try to find previously validated scales. That's why we try to rely on validated scales and measures and not just create our own measures. That's not always possible. And it's important to recognize kind of this quote from Borsboom, which is, basically after a century of theory and research on psychological tests, for most test scores, we still have no idea whether they really measure something or are no more relative arbitrary summations of item responses. And so this is not reflecting well, I think, on the field of psychology, which is kind of in a moment of a reproducibility crisis. But nevertheless, I think relying on widely used scales is important for building confidence from your stakeholders. It's important for building evidence that will be used in other settings. And so making sure that you seek out measures and indicators that you think are going to be real reflections of the value of your program is really the priority here. And so this brings us to our assignment for this week, in which you're going to be selecting indicators and describing indicators for your outcome and impact evaluation. The key here, the steps is, again, identify between 1 and 3 indicator for each outcome. So if you've got 5 outcomes, they need 5 to 15 measures. And then for each indicator, you need to say what it is, how it's defined. So if it's a scale, you need to provide the scale items. If it's a question, provide the question. Identify the data source, how frequently it will be measured. How are you going to compare baseline to follow-up findings, or that sort of thing. And then identify the process of collecting that measure. Are you going to use interviews? Are you going to use surveys? That sort of thing. Who's it going to be collecting that data, and then who's it going to be reported to? So kind of all the kind of process items. If you're looking, a lot of this doesn't necessarily need to go into the weekly assignment, but in your final report, it's important to follow either like a CORIC or STROBE guidelines. These are basically checklists that allow you to kind of identify what you need to report. Now, the thing that I try to stress in this course is that never do these sorts of lists intend to be prescriptive, but you need to look at them to help you think through what you're reporting. I mean, sometimes you turn in, stroke checklist where some things are not applicable. And so if something's not applicable to your study or research group, then don't worry so much about it. But simply, these are good ways to think about the things that you're doing. And so then you organize that information into the table. I also want you to kind of do a search of the literature and data or document searches to try to find a target and baseline value for each of your measures. As I kind of said in the forums last week on process indicators, you can either report target indicators as kind of the % change that you hope to see, or we call that the effect size. What is the effect size of the intervention? So you should have the effect size of each outcome. And that can often be based on previous empirical work regarding the intervention. Each of your interventions have been performed pretty widely in areas, and so hopefully you'll be able to find some measures. Oftentimes, you're just going to have to make educated guesses. Maybe you'll find a baseline prevalence estimate, and you'll say, well, I expect it will result in hopefully at least this much of a change. But I want you to think and justify those well, because it's important that those relate directly back to kind of the objectives and goals of your project. Because in evaluating things like cost and benefits and whatever criteria you're using, understanding where you're at now and where you hope to be is instrumental in evaluating the success or value of a program. And then kind of save that as a PDF file as you're used to, have one group member submit it. We're basically going to look when we grade that. The criteria we'll look for in grading this assignment is, do you identify at least one indicator for each outcome and impact? Do you identify kind of the key elements so we can kind of fully understand that indicator? And then, is it feasible? Is it appropriate? Is it well justified to have the target values that you have, but also are the indicators themselves? If you suggest, we plan on using this scale, but it's 100 items, most workplaces are not going to want you to give a 100-item questionnaire to all of their employees, for example. That's just going to take up too much time and too much productivity. And so you should think through, in the real world, would it be feasible to implement this scale as part of an evaluation of this program? Part of that's going to be, is the program central and core to the organization's mission, or is it just kind of tacked on? And so these should be fit specifically for your intervention and adapted. So that's going to vary from group to group what that ends up looking like in terms of how feasible various tools and measures might be. What might work in one group might not necessarily work on a different project. And that's part of the kind of creative dynamicism that I hope this project will help you to develop. And I hope you really take that away from the course, is no project evaluation is going to be the same. You need to adapt to the needs of the situation, and that includes both the needs of your stakeholders and the needs of the specific populations you're working with, the specific setting and context in which you're working. And so that'll be, again, as with all the other assignments, graded out 3 points. I do want to stress that remember, there are 10 of these individual assignments, and that's worth 30 points. And then the evaluation proposal's final submission is worth 25 points. So that's about worth 55 points. And so you miss 1 point here. It looks like, for this individual assignment, you got 67% if you missed 1 point, or 33% if you missed 2 points. But remember, in the context of the big full assignment, that's only 1 or 2% off of the total score. And so you still, you miss a point here, you're still at 98, 99% on the assignment, still doing well. And so, so that's why we're doing these individual turn-ins, is to ensure that, when you turn in your final proposal, it doesn't get marked down so heavily. We can take off these little bits of points here and there as we evaluate it, but then we give you the feedback so that your overall grade is good. So I do want to just remind you to keep that in perspective, that your individual grades on these assignments, here or there, 67% feels a little bit like an attack, and I understand that because I can see how much hard work you put into these assignments. But then just remember that this is just a small component of the overall project, and that I'm sure most of you, all the groups will do extremely well. And so that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to talk about quantitative methods and survey development. So that's really exciting. And then the week after that is your first quiz. And so that'll be coming soon as well. So with that, I hope you have a good week. Look forward to discussing any questions you have on the discussion boards. And so we'll see you there. Take care.